The petition had been closed for 11 months when Councillor Yenne Dass first noticed the human in the observer gallery. She noticed him because he was quiet. That was not by itself remarkable. The gallery above Chamber 7 was open to any credentialed diplomatic observer, and it regularly filled with aides and clerks who sat through procedural sessions for reasons known only to themselves. But this particular human had been in the gallery for 4 consecutive days, in the same seat near the upper railing, and he did not watch the floor proceedings with the expression of someone being paid to take notes. He watched the chamber the way a cartographer watches an unmapped coast, methodically, without urgency, cataloging distances. He was young. She guessed 23, perhaps 24. He had a small notebook that he wrote in at intervals, but he wrote slowly, as though the words cost something, and he spent far more time looking than recording. She asked her clerk after the session. The human was registered as a junior aide with Earth's diplomatic mission, one Eli Voss, listed in the Galactic Council's accreditation file as a research attaché, second tier. He had arrived 11 days ago. He had not requested any formal meetings, had not filed any agenda items, and was not, as far as the clerk's records showed, attached to any active file before the council. Yenne Dass filed that information in the particular mental drawer she reserved for things that did not yet make sense. She had been a councillor for 6 years, representing the Sethori delegation to the Interior Affairs body, and she had learned to keep that drawer organized. It filled up reliably. The next morning she learned why. Her colleague Councillor Podmore of the Leshari delegation appeared at her office door with the expression of someone who had been caught doing something embarrassing. He said that a human attaché had requested a private meeting twice, been declined twice, and then arrived in his outer office at the first administrative hour with a document packet and a politely worded note asking for 15 minutes. Podmore had given him the 15 minutes because the human had given every indication of being prepared to wait in the outer office indefinitely. What did he want? Yenne asked. Podmore set a slim folder on her desk, 4 pages, with Earth's mission seal and a single line of text. Ray. Application for Provisional Observer Status, reference E7714, filed under the Interior Affairs Procedural Code. She knew the reference number. Earth's mission had filed a petition for Provisional Observer Status 11 months ago, a limited standing to observe proceedings affecting human commercial traffic through the Council's regulated transit corridors. The petition had been technically complete, supported by 8 member states' endorsements. It had failed a ratification vote, 17-9. Several councillors had noted that Earth's presence would create procedural complications. One had noted, less diplomatically, that Interior Affairs sessions were not a seminar for species whose transit volumes were too small to warrant formal standing. The petition had been closed. Earth's mission had filed no appeal. She opened the folder. The 4 pages were a legal analysis, clean, narrow, precise in a way that suggested its author had spent considerable time deciding what not to include. It argued, with specific citations to the Interior Affairs body's own procedural code, that E7714 had been decided on the basis of an incorrect application of the threshold endorsement rule. The vote had proceeded under the assumption that Earth's mission had not met the minimum aggregate transit volume threshold. The analysis, with 4 appendices of transit registry data, argued that the threshold calculation had applied a formula superseded 18 months earlier by an amendment. The body's administrative tier had not propagated to the Petition Review Committee in time for the vote. If the analysis was correct, the vote had been procedurally invalid. Yenne read it twice. Then she set it on her desk and looked at Podmore, who was watching her with the expression of someone who already knew they were about to have a complicated week. "He gave you this," she said. "He said he was not requesting reconsideration," Pod said. He said he was providing documentation that the body might find relevant to its own procedural integrity. Not requesting reconsideration, providing documentation. The distinction was precise enough to be intentional. He also said, Pod added, that he had given identical documentation to 6 other councillors this week. He expected to complete his distribution by the end of this session. Yenne was quiet for a moment. She thought about the young man in the observer gallery, watching the chamber with the attention of someone who was not yet doing anything, only mapping the terrain. She understood now that the 4 days of gallery attendance had not been idle. He had been learning which councillors arrived early, which aides conferred with which other aides during recesses, which delegations sat nearest to each other in the informal social geography that any deliberative body developed over time. He had been learning the chamber before he moved inside it. She spent the afternoon with the folder. The transit registry data in the appendices was publicly available, but correlating it against the correct amended formula and producing a clean legal analysis cited section by section was not a trivial piece of work. Someone had done it carefully and finished it well before Eli Voss had arrived 11 days ago. She requested the Interior Affairs Body's amendment records for the period in question. Her clerk returned in 40 minutes with confirmation. The amendment had been filed, propagated to most administrative subsections, and had simply not reached the Petition Review Committee before the E7714 vote. An ordinary administrative gap. The kind that left institutions open to exactly the argument the folder was making. The folder, she realized, was not an argument for Earth. It was an argument about the body's own procedural record. Any councillor who looked at it and dismissed it was dismissing a question about their institution's administrative accuracy, not a question about how much they valued Earth's presence. That was a harder thing to dismiss. By the following morning, she had heard from 3 other members of the Interior Affairs Body. 2 had received identical document packages. 1 had received a version with an additional appendix tailored to that delegation's specific transit corridor interests. That message, unlike the others, carried a note, a single line asking whether anyone else on the body had flagged the analysis as credible. She went to find Eli Voss in the observer gallery. He was in his usual seat. He saw her come through the entrance and closed his notebook without apparent surprise. She sat in the seat beside him and looked at the chamber floor below, where a subcommittee session on agricultural transit was beginning its preliminary readings. "You've been here since the session opened," she said. "I find the procedural sequencing useful to watch," he said. His voice was even quiet in the way that signals habit, not nerves. "You've given documentation to at least 7 of my colleagues." "I've given documentation to members of the Interior Affairs Body whose delegations have active transit corridor filings," he said. "That's 11. I've finished my distribution." "You need 9 of 17 to call a procedural review," she said. "9 of the 11 whose delegations have active filings," he said. "The other 6 don't have a standing interest in the amendment's application." She looked at him. He was looking at the chamber floor. He was 23 or 24, in a plain mission jacket with no insignia beyond Earth's small seal at the collar, no senior staff, no co-signatories on the documents, no senior ambassador backing the distribution. He had arrived 11 days ago, spent 4 days learning the chamber, and then spent a week walking corridors with a document package and the patient certainty of someone who had decided that the only available path was through. "Who sent you?" she asked. "The documentation speaks for itself," he said. "That isn't what I asked." He turned to look at her directly. "The petition was filed correctly," he said. "The vote was conducted under an error. I'm providing documentation of the error to the members with standing to address it. That's the whole of it." She believed him, which was the problem. Not because he was naive. The distribution strategy alone ruled that out, but because the statement was accurate and he had structured everything around its accuracy so precisely that there was no seam to pull. The thing he handed each councillor was a document about the body's own process, not a petition for sympathy. She went back to her office. She pulled Section 41 of the Interior Affairs Procedural Code, read it the way she read things when she expected to need the precise language later, and thought for a long time. Yenne Dass had voted against E7714 11 months ago. Not among the councillors who made comments for the record, but she had voted no, and she had done so because the petition had struck her as premature. A small species, newly registered, asking for procedural presence in a body still working out its existing membership. She had told herself it was a question of administrative capacity. Looking at the document now, she understood that administrative capacity had not been what she was actually weighing. She had weighed the inconvenience of the accommodation and decided it was not worth the effort. The 4 pages made that distinction visible, even if they did not say so directly. The 4 pages in front of her did not address that calculation. They addressed only the procedural record. But the procedural record, she had to admit, was wrong. She filed the Section 41 request the following morning, a formal notation to the body's chair that a procedural review of E7714 was warranted under the grounds documented in the attached analysis. She did not consult with Pod Moore or any other councillor before filing. By the end of that day, 9 names were on the notation. By the next morning, 11. The body's chair, Councillor Feth, a deliberate administrator who had held the position for 12 years, issued a procedural review notice for the following session, citing the threshold as met and confirming that the administrative error in the amendment's propagation had been verified by the body's own records office. The review session lasted 40 minutes. 3 councillors made brief statements for the record. Then the chair called the ratification question. Petition E7714 was re-voted under the corrected threshold formula. It passed 14-3. Earth's mission would receive provisional observer status in the Galactic Council's Interior Affairs body. Yenne Dass watched Eli Voss receive the notification. She was in the administrative corridor when his mission received the official seal confirmation, close enough to see his face. He read it. His expression did not change the way expressions change when a person has won something unexpected. It changed the way they change when something unfinished is now finished, a small settling, the particular quality of completion. He folded the notification, put it in his jacket pocket, and continued down the corridor. She caught up with him before he reached the mission section. "You started before you arrived," she said. "The legal analysis was ready before you came through registration." He stopped. "The analysis took 3 weeks," he said. "The transit registry data took longer." Alone. The mission's legal archive and the mission's legal aid. She's better at transit registry correlations than I am. She looked at him. This young man who had mapped the chamber for 4 days, delivered 11 document packages in 7 days, said nothing at any point that could be read as advocacy or persuasion, and produced a 14-3 vote on a petition closed for 11 months. 23 or 24 years old, no raised voice, no speech, no debts called in. "You knew it would work," she said. "I knew the documentation was correct," he said. "I knew that at least 9 of the 11 would read it honestly. I didn't know which 9. He paused. "You were the first to file." She had not known he knew that. She had filed through the standard notation channel, which was administrative, not public. He would have had to check the filing timestamp, technically available in the body's transparency records, but not something most people thought to look at. He had looked at it. She stood in the corridor a moment after he had gone, 14-3. On a petition that 3 senior members of her own delegation had told her, 11 months ago, had no realistic path to reconsideration. A young man with a notebook, A 4-page legal analysis, and the patience to wait 4 days before he moved had walked into a closed case and walked back out with it open and resolved. She understood how votes were normally built. Favors called in, coalition managers, the careful social mathematics of who owed what to whom. None of that had happened here. What had happened was cleaner. A person had found the accurate fact at the bottom of an institutional error and handed it, one by one, to the people whose own administrative integrity required them to acknowledge it. Nobody had campaigned, nobody had bargained, nobody had called it winnable. The cause had simply been correct, and a 23-year-old aide had been patient enough to let the correctness do the work. She went back to her office and wrote a note to the body's amendment records office, requesting a systematic review of any other propagation gaps in the prior 18 months. If there was one procedural error of this kind in the record, there were probably others. She wanted to know about them before someone else brought a 4-page analysis to her door. It was, she thought, the least she could do.